Hi, I'm biologist and Bowtech ambassador Jeremy Starks, and welcome back to Whitetail 101. This week we're looking back on our Texas whitetail hunt where Josh kills a giant 180 plus with his round. We're going to show you how to score that buck, and we're going to talk about the importance of being prepared for next whitetail season and how that starts right now. We're going to get you fired up to get those Bowtechs out and start shooting some arrows downrange. To have bucks like this one Josh takes a lot of prep work. Now, that doesn't mean you can't occasionally find one on a public piece of land or just any property you're hunting, but to consistently have big bucks takes a lot of effort. One of the things that we always do and we talk about in a lot of the Whitetail 101 is habitat enhancement, whether that be through food plotting like we have here in Texas or just natural improvement of some of the native vegetation. Now that can be done through mowing, clearing, that can be done through hinge cutting, or just fertilizing some of those native species. But getting prepared for next whitetail season, remember, starts right now. Don't be the guy that waits a week before season to get his bow out and start practicing. Make sure you get them out and shoot all year. Doesn't mean you have to shoot every day, but stay familiar with your equipment. Although these Bowtech bows are extremely accurate and reliable, a lot of archery has to do with the shooter and not just the equipment. There's so many variables, muscle memory, the exact anchor spot. So make sure you get out, fire those bows all summer long, and be prepared for whitetail season. Here we have a typical 10 and a typical 8. These sheds you can score the same way you would score a full rack. The only difference is you're not going to have the score the inside greatest spread, which if you can find both sides, you can score both of them and just kind of guess a spread size so you can determine what the actual score or gross score of that buck would have been. It's a pretty simple process. You measure between the brow tine or guard 1 and the burr. You would measure the center of that and get a circumference measurement here. You get a total of 4 circumference measurements. Your second one will be between the G1 and G2, or the brow and the G2 circumference here. Then between the G2 and G3, you'll get another circumference measurement, and your 4th circumference measurement between the G3 and G4. Now, on an 8-point, you would do the exact same thing, only obviously you don't have the G4. You would measure between the G3 and the end of the main beam, and dead center between that is where you would get your circumference measurement. A lot of people think, well, 10-point or 12-point, you get additional circumference measurements, but that's not the case. So after you get your circumference measurements, you're going to measure the main beam. I like to measure the outside, which will be the greatest distance on that main beam or underneath. Then you will measure each individual tine, brow tine, G1, G2, G3, G4. I like to take a card or something and lay across the main beam so I can get my starting point to measure that particular tine and measure all the way to the tip. Once you get all these measurements, then you will get a greatest inside spread measurement, and add those up will give you a gross score. Again, that's a gross score for Boone and Crockett, Pope and Young. It is a net score, so you'll have deductions on the differences between each individual antler. But that's how you begin to score your deer, and a great way to score your sheds and kind of keep track of what you found and keep inventory on how your bucks are growing. This week we have some great questions, and our first one is from Sudsy21, who asks, how do you calculate deductions on a non-typical? Well, deductions are figured the same whether it's a typical or non-typical rack. First, you determine what the main frame score of that whitetail is, or not necessarily score, but the size of the main frame, whether it's a 6, 8, 10, or 12. Then the difference between the left and right of the main frame is where you get your deductions. So for instance, if it's a main frame 8, and you have a G2 on the left that's 6 inches and a G2 on the right that's 7, that's an inch deduction. Now the abnormal points are added into the total score for a non-typical and deductions on a typical rack. Hope that answers your question, Sudsy. Our next question is from Having a Blast Outdoors, who asks, why is it important to score a whitetail? Well, a lot of hunters want to keep track of their personal best, whether you've killed an 85-inch 8-point and after that first Pope and Young, or you've killed 150s and now you want that 170-inch booner. Keeping track of antler size is a great gauge for deer maturity. In fact, some state agencies and game managers have went to a minimum point to a side or a minimum spread. Now, this is allowing the herd to become more mature and healthier. Again, hope that answers your question. Next question is from Labor C, who asks, are velvet bucks scored on a different scale? The answer is no. Velvet bucks are scored the same way as you do any other rack, but most record books won't allow for a velvet buck to be entered. Now, velvet buck is a great trophy and they're killed typically in early September. Kentucky is a great state to kill a velvet buck. I know Texas has some early seasons. I personally have not shot a velvet buck yet, but hopefully this fall that may change. Our next question is from CJ Spruddles, who asks, how do you score deer in the field? Now, I assume you mean how you score one on the hoof, and that's a really good question. Now, ideally, we have lots of trail cam pictures of that buck where we can look at them from different angles and compare them to vegetation or trees or any other object that's in the picture. But spur of the moment, big buck walks in, how do we get a score and know if he's a shooter? Well, one, we want to look at the age of the deer first and foremost. I really like to take mature bucks, 5.5, 6.5-year-old deer, so knowing how to age that deer is just as important as knowing how to score them. But scoring that rack, I like to look at the ear as a comparison. Now, a mature buck's ears are anywhere between 6 and 7.5 inches. So if you use that as a gauge to look at the tine length or the overall main beam length, that will give you a starting point and start adding it in your head. Boone & Crockett has a great scoring sheet which shows you how a buck is scored, and that will help you add that up quickly in your head. Hope that helps. Our last question is from ZL Woods, who asks, on average, how many inches do you lose in the drying process? Well, again, that varies on when you killed the deer and from animal to animal. But typically it's a very minimal loss and not something that you're too concerned with. Now, taxidermists, every one has a different way they like to keep you from losing that minimal amount, whether it be keep the deer in a freezer or the rack in a freezer, or keep it in a cool, dry place. Check with your local taxidermist, but again, it's not something to typically worry about. We'll see you guys next week. We have some great questions coming up, and keep them coming. Always send your questions to Bowtech, whether on Instagram or Facebook, and we really appreciate you watching.